Tonight on What the Heck Do I Know's PM Update, Work Primed, and Wildcard segments, we're talking about personal finances. This is part 3 of a 3-part series we're doing this week, and in this episode, we will cover contracts. Whether or not you realize it, contracts play a big part in your life and in your personal finances. If you don't understand when you're dealing with a contract or the terms and conditions included, it can end up costing you a lot of money and hassles. Do you always realize when you're entering into a contract? Do you always understand what you're agreeing to if you do? I'm guessing the answer is no for a number of our viewers. Don't worry though, this show is going to help you out. Stay tuned for more insights into contracts. Hey guys, I really enjoy making these videos for you, so if you get value from them or know someone who would, please support us by hitting like, subscribe, leaving comments, and sharing. What the Heck Do I Know presents PM Update with Leah and Mia. And now your host, Leah. Welcome back to PM Update. I'm Leah. Tonight we have 2 segments on contracts. In Work Primed, we show project management in the workplace. Wildcard segments can be about anything, and tonight both are about contracts, and about how contracts can affect your personal finances. Most of you probably enter into contracts every day. Did you know that every time you click agree to terms and conditions for using software, you are entering into a contract? Luckily, it's not one that's likely to affect your personal finances, especially if you're like me and never read those. But still, it's a contract. To give some examples of the areas of your life where you will see contracts that do affect your personal finances, we are showcasing Nick Norris as he navigates through his contract experiences for this week. Mia, can you give us a heads up about what you have in store for us? Absolutely, Leah. Nick Norris is a project manager and owner of a construction company, and he is big on making sure he understands his contracts. He thinks that understanding the terms and condition of all your contracts can help you save money and reduce the amount of stress in your life. Nick says that he learned about how important understanding a contract is on his very first project as a foreman. It's easy to understand why knowledge and understanding of contracts is important on projects, especially construction. But what about in your personal life? He says it's just as important there as it is at work. In fact, he feels so strongly about this, he agreed to talk to us about both. Sounds like a good show then, Mia. Now, according to PMI, a contract is a mutually binding agreement that obligates the seller to provide the specified product, service, or result, and obligates the buyer to pay for it. In other words, it is an attempt to state clearly what the buyer wants at the end and the seller should provide. The purpose is to protect both parties. Sometimes they're difficult to understand because of the language used. This isn't an attempt to confuse you, but just to be clear as possible. Legal jargon has specific known definitions, and in our everyday language, some words can mean different things to different people, which can cause misunderstandings. Now, I don't own a construction company, but while doing research for this show, I looked up a couple of my contracts, one from my cell phone provider and one from my insurance company, and was quite pleased to see that in addition to the full legal documents, a plain English version was also available for both of them. If you have a contract where both versions are available, you can figure out how to read the complicated version from comparing the two. So I am challenging you to look one up this week and see what you find. Let us know in the comments if you find both. Now, for our first quote question of the day, do you know who said, "Read your contracts up and down, left and right"? The answer to this question and Mia and Nick's stories when we return, so stay tuned. Nick Norris is no stranger to contract conversations in the office. They happen every day and sometimes several times a day. This week was no different for him. And since we're tagging along, we get to experience it with him. This week we have examples to share from his client and one of his subcontractors. Nick attends a stakeholders meeting once a week to give and get updates from his client and the various subcontractors on the project. This week, he got a heads up that his client wanted to make some changes to the building. He hasn't heard what kind of changes, but he's coming prepared with a copy of the change management plan so that he can refer to it if needed. He says this should be particularly interesting for us to see how it plays out. The meeting starts out normally with Nick as the prime contractor giving his updates on progress and any challenges they are having. When it gets to the client's turn, he finally gets to find out what the proposed changes are. The client wants to change some of the finish material items. The contract states that these materials must be from an approved product list, and the client has found something new that is supposed to be better than what is on the list. Better quality and longer lasting. Nick is somewhat agreeable to the plan if he can cancel his current pre-order with no cost implications, but he notes that since this product is not on the list yet, it would be a risk for him to purchase them right away. During a break in the meeting, the client agrees to submit all of the documentation to his internal team in order to get them on the approved list. He thinks it will be a matter of a couple of weeks. Nick agrees to make some calls to find out about his current order and the lead time of the new material, and reminds his client that if they don't get added to the approved product list in time, this will need to go through the formal change management process. His client considers this, and since that process normally takes a couple of weeks at minimum, asks Nick to start the change process now, just in case. In the second half of the meeting, one of the subcontractors also has a request. This subcontractor was installing underground utilities, and their trenches were flooded during a rain event yesterday. If they don't rent pumps to clear the trenches today and get them dried out, they will lose 3 additional days of work, and they will miss a milestone to complete their work in that area for the next contractor. He wants to be reimbursed for the cost of the pumps. Nick does not comment on this one immediately because he says he needs to check the subcontract for the force majeure clauses, otherwise known as acts of God. He also reminds the subcontractor that whether he gets reimbursed for it or not, he is still obligated to meet his schedule, and there are consequences for missing the milestone, highly recommending that he not waste time waiting and get the trenches cleared as soon as possible. He also tells the subcontractor to send the cost estimate to him so that he knows how much the damage is if it is his responsibility. As soon as he gets back to his office, he asks his administrative assistant to start the change management process after giving her some basic information, and he would complete it later. Then he checked the written agreement with his supplier and sees that his order can be canceled 60 days ahead of shipping with no fees. But there is a 1% charge for cancellation between 59 and 0 days. He checks his calendar to see they are not in the 60-day window yet, but they will be next week. He also notes that there is no fee if, instead of canceling the order, you replace the material with something different. Then he started making calls. When he spoke to his supplier, they said they didn't have the new material in stock yet, but they had ordered it from the manufacturer and were expecting it in 3 weeks. If they received it when promised, the lead time would be the same as for the original material order. Now, there are a lot of ifs in the information he has so far, which is something Nick does not trust. Once other contractors find out this supplier has the new item in stock, if he hasn't already placed an order, it will probably be too late to get the amount he needs in time to complete his work. Nick thought through his options and then called his client to give him an update. Moving forward with this change was a risk to both sides because of the amount of uncertainty in this proposal. Since this was a new product, it was possible the supplier would not receive it when promised from the manufacturer. It was also possible that the product might not be as perfect as the client thought. The change process could take as little as a week or as long as 4 weeks, risking the product not being available anymore if other orders were placed before theirs. The approved product review could take a day or several weeks. Any of these could lead to a delay in Nick finishing his work. Being the careful person that he is, Nick insisted that the entire set of risks be placed on the client side in the documented change, since they were the ones requesting the change. His client agreed, so Nick completed the change request documentation. Now that the client change request was completed, Nick went through the subcontract. He was pretty sure what the answer to this question would be, but he still looked it up to make sure. His subcontractor was indeed responsible for all the force majeure damages, and he would not be required to pay for the pumps. His subcontractor had three choices: pay for the pumps himself, or wait for it to dry out and work his crew overtime to make up for the lost time, or miss the milestone and pay the consequences. In all situations, it was going to cost him money. Nick called the subcontractor back to the project and explained the situation to him. The pumps were likely to be the least expensive of the three options, and the best option for the subcontractor's reputation. The subcontractor was not happy about it, but agreed to bring in the pumps and get his team back to work as soon as possible. In just one meeting, Nick needed to review two different contracts, one between him and his client, and one between him and his subcontractor. Now, being familiar with both helped him to respond during the meeting without making any commitments one way or the other until he had double-checked to make sure. Over the years, he has seen many of both kinds of contracts, and he didn't want to commit to something until he was absolutely sure he was remembering the right contract. Still, once he was certain, he was able to assess his risk in both situations and advise his colleagues on a course of action based on what the contract says. Usually his contracts have too much information to memorize all of it, and he thinks you should always have a reference copy to refer to anyway. That is great information on contracts, Mia. Thanks for giving us an inside look on a project manager dealing with contract issues. I really hope his client gets the new material and the subcontractor gets the trenches dried out. As Mia and Nick mentioned, it is always good to be familiar enough with whatever contract you have to be able to answer general questions about it and make some educated guesses. But you should never commit to any changes until you have done the research and know what the expectations and responsibilities are for both you and the other party. His subcontractor probably already knew that the contract did not allow for additional payments for damage due to rain. It's likely he asked in this way, hoping to get something he wasn't entitled to. And now the answer to our quote question from the top of the show. Do you know who said, "Read your contracts, up and down, left and right"? That was singer, songwriter, and former member of Fifth Harmony, Lauren Harrigrey. In the second half of our show, Nick shows that understanding contracts isn't just for use at work. It is actually extremely beneficial to your home life as well. Knowing your rights and the promises made by a service provider can save you money and a lot of hassles. We also have a second quote question. Do you know who said, "Consumers get used to reading and understanding their credit card contracts, their mortgages, their check overdraft agreements? Those are good things. That puts power back in the hands of consumers." The answer and the rest of Mia and Nick's story when we return, so please stick around. Even if you aren't a construction contractor, you have contracts that affect your daily life. Loans like car and mortgage are the biggest, and generally as long as you pay on these on time, you won't have any issues. All the services you use every day usually come with contracts too. The utilities at your house, including your cable, internet, telephone, electric, are provided to you for a fee and terms and conditions for use. Knowing the terms of all your contracts that you have in your life can save you a lot of hassle and stress when things aren't perfect. Nick always makes a point of reviewing his contracts before signing, and again when something goes awry. Nick has contract issues that aren't directly related to his work, too. Things aren't always happening with his inventory, workforce, and equipment that make being familiar with his various contracts helpful. This week, one of his foremen quit and turned in his cell phone on his last day. Nick didn't have a replacement for him yet, but expected to hire someone in the next week or two. Nick was going to cancel the service for that line to save money until he reviewed the terms of service with his cell phone provider. His cell phone company does not cancel charges until the last day of the billing period, which is 3 weeks away. If he had canceled, he would have been charged the full amount for the phone because it was on a payment plan, and then charged again for reopening the line for the new foreman he would be hiring. Reviewing the contract before making any changes allowed him to keep things just as they were to avoid additional fees. Nick also had an employee involved in a minor accident by backing into a pole. After reviewing his insurance policy and seeing the $800 deductible, he decided the dent wasn't that big of a deal for a work vehicle. Most of them already had dents and dings in them anyway. Last year, one of them had a major collision. Luckily, no one was hurt, but getting it running again was well over the $800 deductible. Nick leases warehouse space for some of his construction materials that need to be out of the elements. Generally, these are finish items that need to be protected to avoid damage, and some of them need to be in a temperature-controlled facility. As a part of his lease agreement, the warehouse owner is responsible for managing the temperature and insurance for the inventory in the event of failure. There was a cold snap at the beginning of the week, and the heat went out, damaging some of the seals he had stored. They weren't particularly expensive, or very many of them, but Nick made sure to remind the warehouse owner of the terms of their agreement to get them replaced at no cost to him. Nick's daughter was also moving out on her own. She had her own cable service in her room and had signed up for a minimum 2-year contract with a promotional rate. When she initially called the cable company to disconnect her service, they told her there would be penalties for canceling early. After she talked to her dad, they reviewed the contract together and found a clause in the agreement that stated if the reason for disconnecting service early was because of a move, and that company did not provide service in the new location, then penalties would be waived. They checked the service area on the company website, and they did not operate where her new apartment was located. When she called back, she had to remind them of this clause, and she was not charged the penalties. Nick's wife, Nora, had a condo before they met. When they decided to move in together and get married, rather than selling it, she decided to keep it as a rental property. Since she is the owner, by the terms of the lease agreement, she is required to keep the apartment in repair, provided that the tenant is not abusing the property. Nora's tenant is pretty responsible, but things still break and need to be fixed. In reality, Nick does all of the maintenance and repairs for Nora's property to save money rather than hiring an outside company to do the work. In addition to not abusing the property, the tenant is required to comply with all of the Homeowners Association rules and signed an agreement to this effect. One of the rules says that there is no overnight street parking in the complex and a fine assessed for breaking the rule. When the tenant was having shelves installed in the garage, the workers did not finish in one day, so she was unable to park in her garage. Their tenant knew about the rule, but did not request an exemption because she didn't think anyone would notice, and that the rule was really there to discourage overnight visitors. She was mistaken, and when Nick and Nora received the notice and fine, had to inform the tenant that she was responsible for paying it due to the contract. Nick says that he learned how important contracts were to his life when he first became a foreman on a job. He hadn't read the contract and made a mistake during construction. He was fortunate that the mistake didn't cost his employer too much to fix and was forgiven. But after the lecture he got, before he started any new task after that, his rule was to read the contract. Nick says that after that incident, not only was he reading the contract, but he even read parts of it to his team after their morning safety meetings, especially if there was something particularly relevant to the work they were doing that day. It's a habit that has stuck with him through the years, and he doesn't see any reason to change. Nick's colleagues and family sure do benefit from his attention to detail and his habit of actually reading his contracts. In the work situations, Nick was able to make a full assessment of the different situations and come up with solutions, putting the responsibility where it belonged instead of taking it on himself. That's another function of contracts, putting responsibility where it belongs. In the family situations we saw, a couple of people needed a gentle reminder of the agreement terms in order to comply with them, but it's hard to argue with the paperwork you created for your own services. Now, for the answer to our final quote question for today. Do you know who said consumers get used to reading and understanding their credit card contracts, their mortgages, their check overdraft agreements? Those are good things. That puts power back in the hands of the consumers. That was U.S. Senator and former law professor Elizabeth Warren. Now that's all for What the Heck Do I Know's PM Update with Leah and Mia and our Work Primed and Wildcard segments for this week. Thank you for watching and see you next time on our next episode of PM Update. Good night. Hey guys, don't forget to support these videos by hitting like and subscribe. I love seeing comments too.